The development of the Soviet Katyusha rocket artillery cannot be separated from the broader interwar context of military innovation and the strategic anxieties of the 1930s. In the aftermath of the Russian Civil War, the Soviet Union invested heavily in experimental weaponry that could offset its relative industrial weakness compared to Western powers. Artillery had been the god of war during World War I, and Soviet doctrine after 1921 maintained artillery as the central arm for both offensive and defensive operations. Yet traditional towed guns were slow, manpower intensive, and required years of industrial buildup. Soviet planners sought weapons that could deliver overwhelming firepower in short bursts, using mobility and surprise to disrupt enemy formations. Experiments with rocketry had begun in Russia even before the revolution. In 1921, engineer Nikolai Tikhomirov established the Gas Dynamics Laboratory, GDL, in Petrograd, later merged into the Reactive Scientific Research Institute, RNII. The institute pursued solid fuel and liquid fuel rocket technology, supported by figures such as Georgy Langemak, Ivan Klemyonov, and Valentin Glushko. While much of the research initially focused on aviation propulsion and experimental aircraft, by the late 1920s and early 1930s, attention shifted toward military applications, especially artillery rockets. Early prototypes of solid-fuel rockets with calibers ranging from 82 mm to 132 mm demonstrated potential for saturation fire when mounted in batteries. Unlike conventional artillery shells, rockets could be manufactured with simpler processes, a decisive advantage for a state anticipating large-scale war. The geopolitical context heightened the urgency of these projects. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, and by 1935-36 rearmament was evident across Europe. The Soviet Union, alarmed by both German militarization and Japanese advances in Manchuria, expanded its weapons programs. At the same time, purges within the Red Army and the Soviet scientific community in 1937-38 disrupted development. Key engineers, including Klemyonov and Langemak, were arrested and executed, leaving Tikhomirov's successors to push the project forward under more constrained conditions. Despite this disruption, prototypes of multiple rocket launchers had been tested as early as 1938, mounted on light trucks and rail platforms, firing M13 rockets of 132 mm caliber. These trials showed that a salvo of 16 rockets could devastate an area target within seconds, though accuracy remained poor, beyond 5 kilometers. Soviet military doctrine in the late 1930s emphasized deep operations, using rapid, concentrated strikes to break through enemy defenses and encircle formations. Rocket artillery fitted neatly into this concept, as it could deliver immediate firepower in support of breakthroughs. However, the Soviet Union entered the Second World War poorly prepared. The Winter War against Finland in 1939-40 exposed severe weaknesses in Soviet artillery coordination, logistics, and mobility. Although Katyusha prototypes were not used in Finland, the conflict accelerated demands for more flexible fire support weapons. By 1940, the RNII had finalized designs for the BM-13 launcher, firing 132 mm rockets with an explosive warhead of nearly 5 kilograms. Mounted on the ZIS-6 three-axle truck, the launcher carried 16 rails and could fire an entire salvo in 7 to 10 seconds. Industrial capacity was another decisive factor. By June 1941, the Soviet Union had only a limited number of BM-13s, fewer than 40 operational launchers, but factories in Moscow, Voronezh, and Kuibyshev were already preparing for mass production. German intelligence had no confirmed knowledge of this weapon before Operation Barbarossa, and Wehrmacht assessments of Soviet artillery focused primarily on conventional guns. The Red Army itself regarded the weapon as highly secret. Even during trials, Katyusha launchers were guarded, and their designation as BM-13 deliberately obscured their nature. The codename Katyusha arose informally from the popular wartime song of the same name, a diminutive of Ekaterina, though the Red Army officially referred to them as Guards Mortars. Once dedicated rocket artillery regiments were formed. By the eve of the German invasion, the Soviet Union possessed the scientific foundations, prototypes, an early production of a new category of weapon that promised to alter the balance of firepower. Yet its scale was limited, its doctrine untested, and its role uncertain. The stage was set for the first real demonstration of Stalin's rocket artillery in the opening months of the Great Patriotic War, when the weapon would be unveiled not only to the Wehrmacht, but also to Soviet troops themselves, who had never before witnessed such concentrated rocket fire. When Operation Barbarossa began on 22 June 1941, the Soviet Union faced the largest invasion in history. 3 German army groups advanced on a 2,900-kilometer front with 3.3 million soldiers, 3,350 tanks, and over 7,000 artillery pieces. The Red Army, despite having more than 5 million men mobilized and significant reserves of artillery, was caught by surprise and suffered catastrophic losses in the first weeks. Within this unfolding disaster, the still-secret rocket launchers received their first baptism of fire. On 14 July 1941, near the town of Orsha in Belarus, a battery of 7 BM-13 Katysha launchers was deployed under the command of Captain Ivan Flerov. Their target was a German concentration of troops, fuel depots, and railway facilities supporting the advance of Army Group Center. The battery fired a salvo of 112 rockets in less than 10 seconds. Contemporary reports describe widespread fires, explosions, and confusion across the German positions. Exact casualty figures remain uncertain, but German logistics in the sector were disrupted, and Soviet command noted the psychological effect. This engagement is recognized as the first combat use of the Katyusha. Following Orsha, Soviet High Command ordered the creation of independent Guards mortar units, the designation chosen to conceal the true nature of the weapon. By August 1941, the 1st Guards Mortar Regiment was formed, consisting of 4 batteries with BM-13 launchers. These units were directly subordinated to the Stavka and were treated as strategic assets rather than divisional support weapons. Their mobility, achieved through the truck-mounted system, allowed rapid relocation after each salvo, minimizing the risk of counter-battery fire. German soldiers who encountered the weapon in the field quickly gave it nicknames. Some referred to it as the Stalin Orgel, or Stalin's organ, because of both the appearance of the launch rails and the howling sound of the rockets in flight. Reports from German divisions along the Smolensk axis in August 1941 mention the massive rocket fire of unusual type, noting its destructive effect on soft-skinned vehicles, infantry positions, and supply depots. However, they also observed the inaccuracy of the rockets compared to conventional artillery. Concentrated fire could devastate an area target, but precision strikes against hardened bunkers or dispersed formations were far less effective. During the defense of Smolensk in July-August 1941, additional Katyusha batteries were employed. Soviet records indicate that by early August, around 140 BM-13 launchers were in service. These were used in concentrated barrages against German assembly areas and bridging operations across the Dnieper River. Although the overall outcome of the battle was a German advance, Soviet sources credit the Katyusha units with inflicting delays and causing disorganization in several sectors, buying time for defensive regrouping. The secrecy surrounding the weapon remained strict. Crews were ordered to destroy their launchers if capture was imminent, and security detachments accompanied each battery. Despite these precautions, the Wehrmacht captured some unexploded rockets in late summer 1941, which allowed German ordnance specialists to begin studying their construction. This accelerated German development of their own multiple rocket launchers, most notably the Nebelwerfer, which had already been in prototype form since the late 1930s but was now given higher production priority. By the autumn of 1941, the presence of Katyusha units was no longer limited to isolated batteries. As the battle for Moscow approached, the Red Army deployed Guards mortar regiments in coordinated mass fire missions. Each regiment could field up to 36 launchers, delivering more than 500 rockets in a single salvo. The logistical challenge of resupplying such units was considerable. Each BM-13 carried only 16 rockets and required up to 2 hours for reloading. demanding large ammunition stockpiles and dedicated transport. Nevertheless, the opening phase of the war demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the new weapon. Its mobility, saturation firepower, and psychological impact exceeded expectations. At the same time, its limited accuracy, dependence on prepared logistics, and vulnerability when stationary highlighted the need for doctrinal adaptation. In the desperate battles of 1941, the Soviet Union had unveiled a weapon that captured the attention of friend and foe alike, marking the beginning of the Katyusha's role as a central instrument of Soviet artillery strategy. As the initial shock of Barbarossa evolved into prolonged campaigns, the Soviet High Command recognized that the Katyusha had to be integrated systematically into the overall strategy of the Red Army. The central issue was not merely the weapon itself, but how to scale production, organize specialized units, and ensure logistical sustainability under conditions of massive territorial loss and industrial evacuation. The period from late 1941 through 1942 marked the decisive phase when the Katyusha transitioned from an experimental novelty into a standardized component of Soviet firepower. Strategic planning revolved around three interconnected objectives. The first was mass production. Before the war, the BM-13 launcher had been produced only in small numbers at the compressor plant in Moscow. Following the German advance toward the capital in October 1941, the factory was evacuated to Kuibyshev, where production resumed under extraordinary wartime conditions. Additional facilities in Voronezh, Gorky, and Chelyabinsk were mobilized to manufacture both launchers and rockets. By the end of 1941, approximately 593 BM-13s had been produced, a dramatic expansion compared to the handful available in June. In 1942, Soviet industry produced over 3,200 Katyusha launchers, alongside nearly 10 million M13 rockets. This expansion was made possible by standardized designs and the relative simplicity of solid-fuel rocket manufacturing compared to heavy artillery pieces. The second objective was doctrinal integration. In August 1941, the Stavka created the first Guards mortar regiments, each consisting of 3 or 4 battalions with 36 launchers in total. By the spring of 1942, the Red Army began forming entire Guards mortar brigades, which could field more than 140 launchers, organized into multiple regiments with their own logistics and command staff. These formations were treated as strategic artillery assets, often held under front-level or even Supreme Command reserve, to be committed at decisive moments rather than dispersed among divisions. This organizational approach reflected the Soviet doctrine of massed firepower. Rather than spreading resources thinly, the Red Army concentrated rocket artillery for maximum shock effect. The third objective was adaptation to logistical realities. Each BM-13 launcher could fire a 16-rocket salvo in less than 10 seconds, saturating an area of several hectares. Yet reloading the launcher was labor-intensive and time-consuming. A well-trained crew required at least 50 minutes to 1 hour to fully reload, and each salvo demanded nearly 700 kilograms of rockets. This meant that a single regiment could expend hundreds of tons of ammunition in a single day of combat. To sustain operations, the Red Army established dedicated supply battalions equipped with Studebaker US-6 trucks delivered through Lend-Lease, which by 1942 became the primary transport for Katyusha units. Without these logistical vehicles, the full potential of the weapon would have been compromised. German intelligence by early 1942 had a clearer understanding of the Katyusha's capabilities. Reports from the Eastern Front noted that Soviet rocket batteries were typically deployed behind infantry and tank formations, firing concentrated salvos at German staging areas or defensive lines just before Soviet attacks. The Wehrmacht assessed the weapon as imprecise but devastating against troop concentrations, artillery parks, and supply depots. As a countermeasure, the Germans accelerated production of their own multiple rocket launchers. The 150mm Nebelwerfer 41, mounted on a 6-tube launcher, entered widespread service in 1942. Although more accurate than the Katyusha, the Nebelwerfer was less mobile and slower to reload. Both sides thus developed competing philosophies. The Soviets emphasized massed salvos and rapid mobility, while the Germans prioritized accuracy and integration into divisional artillery groups. By mid-1942, as the Wehrmacht prepared its summer offensive toward the Volga and the Caucasus, Operation Blue, the Red Army fielded dozens of Guards mortar regiments across the front. During defensive operations near Voronezh and Stalingrad, Katysha units were employed to disrupt German assembly areas, particularly before armored assaults. Soviet records show that on 7 July 1942, near Voronezh, a concentrated salvo from multiple regiments fired over 2,000 rockets in minutes, forcing elements of the German 24th Panzer Division to halt their attack temporarily. While not decisive, such actions slowed the momentum of German advances and inflicted heavy logistical damage. Propaganda also became a factor. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts highlighted the role of the mysterious new weapon, often exaggerating its accuracy and destructive power. The term Guards mortars suggested elite status, and the code name Katyusha entered popular consciousness through songs and poems. German troops, meanwhile, expressed both fear and contempt. Letters from the front described the terror induced by the sound of incoming rockets, though experienced soldiers noted that survival often depended on whether one was within the impact zone. Production diversity increased during this period. In addition to the standard BM-13, the Soviets introduced lighter BM-8 launchers firing 82 mm rockets, which could be mounted on smaller trucks, jeeps, or even tanks, and heavier BM-31 launchers firing 310 mm rockets with a warhead of up to 28 kilograms of explosive. This variety allowed greater flexibility. Lighter launchers could accompany mobile units, while heavy launchers were deployed in fortified sectors or for preparation of offensives. By the end of 1942, the Red Army had created a layered rocket artillery system capable of engaging targets from light field defenses to urban strongholds. The scale of deployment by late 1942 illustrates the transformation. Soviet records indicate that the Red Army fielded over 300 Guards mortar battalions, equating to more than 1,500 launchers, with reserves being continuously trained and supplied. Each major front had at least several brigades available for decisive actions. For comparison, at the start of the German summer offensive in June 1942, Army Group South deployed around 1.4 million soldiers, 1,200 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft. The Red Army responded not only with manpower, but with concentrated firepower, in which the Katyusha played an increasingly central role. The strategic planning phase thus concluded with the institutionalization of rocket artillery as one of the Soviet Union's most distinctive contributions to modern warfare. The combination of mass production, organizational concentration, and logistical adaptation ensured that by the end of 1942, the Katyusha was no longer an experimental weapon, but a standardized and feared component of Soviet combat operations. It would soon demonstrate its full potential in the largest battles of the war, where massed rocket fire would become a decisive factor in shaping the battlefield. During the final months of 1942 and into 1943, the Katyusha was no longer an experimental addition, but a fully integrated element of Soviet combat operations. The first major testing ground for massed rocket artillery came in the defensive and offensive battles around Stalingrad, where the Red Army concentrated not just divisions and tank corps, but also whole brigades of Guards mortars. This period marked the moment when Katyushas moved from a tactical weapon of surprise into a permanent tool for shaping the battlefield on a strategic scale. The first large-scale use in the Stalingrad sector occurred in late August 1942, when German 6th Army crossed the Don River and approached the Volga. Soviet defenders, short of tanks and aircraft, relied heavily on artillery to slow the German advance. On 23 August, multiple Guards mortar regiments deployed east of the Don and fired concentrated salvos at German pontoon bridges and staging areas. Soviet records describe the launching of over 3,000 rockets in a single day. Although German engineers repaired crossings and infantry continued to advance, the rocket barrages delayed armored spearheads and destroyed ammunition convoys. For the defenders, Katyusha salvos provided not only material damage, but also much-needed morale, symbolizing that the Red Army could strike back even in retreat. Once the fighting entered the city itself, Katyusha fire shifted toward supporting urban defense. The BM-13 and BM-31 rockets were used to bombard German positions on the outskirts and along key avenues of approach. However, the dense urban terrain reduced the effectiveness of wide-area saturation fire. Accuracy remained a limitation, and uncontrolled salvos sometimes struck Soviet positions. For this reason, Katyusha units were often held for pre-planned strikes against identified German concentrations rather than for continuous support. During September and October 1942, Soviet commanders increasingly reserved rocket artillery for massive counter-preparation fires before planned local counterattacks. One documented case occurred on 14 October when 3 Guards mortar regiments fired in coordination with conventional artillery to disrupt a German assault against the tractor factory. The barrage inflicted serious losses on the attacking infantry, giving Soviet defenders time to regroup. The turning point came with Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive launched on 19 November 1942. In this operation, rocket artillery was committed on an unprecedented scale. According to official Soviet figures, over 2,500 Katyusha launchers were concentrated along the flanks of the German Sixth Army. In the opening hours, Soviet artillery, including Guards mortar brigades, delivered a 2-hour barrage against Romanian 3rd and 4th Army positions. Salvos of thousands of rockets combined with heavy conventional artillery fire shattered defensive lines, destroyed communication centers, and caused widespread disarray. The Katyusha's role in this phase was particularly effective against poorly equipped Axis allies who lacked adequate fortifications or armored support. Romanian units reported near-total destruction of trenches and morale collapse under the rocket bombardments. In the encirclement phase, Katyushas continued to provide concentrated fire against German relief attempts. During Operation Winter Storm in December 1942, when Army Group Dawn attempted to break through to Stalingrad, Soviet forces employed rocket artillery to blunt the advance of the 57th Panzer Corps. Salvos targeted road junctions and assembly areas, forcing delays and contributing to the eventual failure of the relief effort. Meanwhile, within the encircled pocket, Katyushas bombarded supply depots and airfields whenever intelligence identified concentrations. Although the German Luftwaffe maintained some air supply until late January 1943, rocket fire destroyed multiple landing strips and disrupted loading operations. The battle demonstrated both the destructive and the logistical dimensions of rocket artillery. A single brigade, equipped with more than 140 launchers, could expend thousands of rockets in a few days, consuming hundreds of tons of ammunition. Soviet supply planners, relying heavily on rail networks and motor transport, had to prioritize rocket ammunition shipments alongside conventional shells. The increasing availability of Lend-Lease trucks, especially Studebakers, was crucial in sustaining this pace. Soviet reports acknowledge that without Allied vehicles, massed rocket artillery would not have been able to redeploy and resupply at the speed required during Uranus and subsequent operations. German countermeasures during this period highlighted the importance of mobility. Once a Katyusha battery fired, the trajectory revealed its approximate position. German artillery attempted immediate counter-battery fire, while Luftwaffe aircraft targeted suspected launch sites. Soviet doctrine adapted by emphasizing the shoot-and-move tactic. Crews were trained to launch a full salvo in under 10 seconds, and then immediately drive to a new concealed position. This greatly reduced losses, though not entirely. By early 1943, German reports estimated that dozens of Katyusha launchers had been destroyed or captured in various engagements. Despite these risks, the psychological impact of the weapon continued to grow. Captured German diaries and letters from Stalingrad frequently mention the terror of the Stalin Orgel. Soldiers described the sound of approaching rockets as unlike conventional artillery, inducing a sense of helplessness because the entire area might be blanketed with explosions. This effect, combined with the destruction of supply depots and assembly points, made the Katyusha an effective tool not only of physical damage, but also of morale warfare. The final stages of the Stalingrad campaign saw Soviet rocket artillery deployed for the final reduction of the pocket in January 1943. Concentrated barrages preceded infantry assaults on German strongpoints, softening defenses before close-quarters fighting. On 26 January, when Soviet forces split the pocket into northern and southern sectors, Guards mortar brigades were heavily engaged in pre-assault bombardments. By the time Paulus surrendered on 2 February, the Katysha had established its reputation as one of the defining weapons of the Eastern Front. In terms of figures, by early 1943, the Soviet Union fielded more than 3,500 Katysha launchers of various types, with production continuing to rise. The total number of rockets manufactured by the end of 1942 exceeded 12 million. This scale reflected both the adaptability of Soviet industry and the recognition that rocket artillery had become indispensable. The Battle of Stalingrad demonstrated that when employed in mass and with proper logistical support, the Katyusha could influence the outcome of entire operations. It was not a precision weapon, but it was a tool of operational shock, capable of disrupting enemy plans on a large scale. From this point onward, the Katyusha was no longer seen as a secondary innovation, but as a permanent feature of Red Army firepower. Its role in Stalingrad set the precedent for future battles, where rocket artillery would be massed in even greater numbers. The experience gained in coordinating salvos with infantry and armor paved the way for the weapon's role in the coming year, when the largest armored clash in history would place the Katyusha at the center of Soviet defensive and offensive planning. Through the year 1943, the Soviet Union's use of rocket artillery expanded in both scale and sophistication, but it also revealed significant challenges that commanders and industry had to overcome. The Katyusha had proven its effectiveness at Stalingrad, yet its widespread deployment required constant adaptation in tactics, supply, and organization. The period from early 1943 to the spring of 1944 can be described as one of escalation and crisis management. Escalation in the sense of mass deployment and integration into large operations, and crisis in the sense of sustaining production, addressing technical limitations, and countering German responses. By January 1943, Soviet industry had produced over 3,500 Katyusha launchers, with output continuing to rise despite the strain of wartime evacuation and the ongoing need for tanks and conventional artillery. Production facilities in Kuibyshev, Gorky, and Sverdlovsk were manufacturing thousands of BM-13 launchers, while new variants such as the BM-8 and BM-31 were also entering service. The BM-8 fired smaller 82mm rockets, often mounted on light trucks, jeeps, or even armored carriers, while the BM-31 fired heavy 310mm rockets with warheads up to 28 kilograms. This diversification reflected Soviet attempts to tailor rocket artillery to different tactical needs: light weapons for mobile units, heavy rockets for breaching fortified lines. However, the sheer scale of production created logistical strains. Each salvo of a BM-13 required nearly 700 kilograms of rockets, and larger brigades consumed hundreds of tons of ammunition in a single major battle. Supply lines depended on both Soviet and Lend-Lease transport vehicles. By 1943, thousands of American Studebaker US-6 trucks had entered service, and these became the preferred carriers for Katyusha launchers due to their reliability and off-road performance. Soviet commanders noted that without these vehicles, mass redeployment of rocket units during fast-moving operations would have been impossible. Yet even with this support, shortages of rockets were frequent, particularly during periods of sustained offensives when ammunition consumption exceeded planned deliveries. German countermeasures grew more sophisticated in 1943. The Wehrmacht had fielded the 150mm Nebelwerfer 41 in 1942, but by mid-1943, larger caliber versions such as the 210mm and 300mm Nebelwerfer were deployed. These offered more accuracy and heavier warheads than Soviet rockets, though at the cost of mobility. German artillery doctrine increasingly integrated Nebelwerfers into combined arms fire plans, supporting both defensive positions and counterattacks. Luftwaffe units were also directed to locate and strike Katyusha batteries immediately after salvos. The Soviet shoot-and-move doctrine remained the only reliable counter, requiring strict discipline and coordination within Guards mortar brigades. Even so, German reports in 1943 list dozens of captured or destroyed launchers, showing that mobility could not eliminate all losses. Another issue was accuracy. Soviet rockets were effective in area bombardments, but dispersion increased dramatically beyond 6 kilometers, limiting their usefulness in precision strikes. Tests conducted in early 1943 confirmed that only massed fire could compensate for this inaccuracy. As a result, Guards mortar units were rarely assigned piecemeal tasks. They were reserved for preparatory or counter-preparatory fires, often coordinated with artillery and aviation. This concentration made them effective, but also created predictability, as the Germans learned to expect rocket barrages before major Soviet offensives. The crisis dimension was also political. The prestige of Guards mortar units was high, and Stavka emphasized their symbolic value in communiques and propaganda. However, this meant commanders sometimes demanded rocket support even when conditions did not warrant it, leading to wasteful expenditures of ammunition. Reports from early 1943 describe entire regiments expending thousands of rockets on targets that were already abandoned or dispersed. Soviet General Staff attempted to regulate usage through stricter control at front-level commands, but the tension between operational need and propaganda demands persisted throughout the war. Despite these problems, the weapon's presence was increasingly decisive. During the Soviet counteroffensive at Orel in July 1943, Katysha units participated in massive bombardments designed to disrupt German defensive preparations. Concentrated firepower allowed Soviet infantry and armor to advance against entrenched positions, even though losses remained high. In the same month at Kursk, the weapon would achieve its greatest deployment yet, setting the stage for a turning point in the war. By the spring of 1944, the Red Army had created over 500 Guards mortar battalions, with more than 3,000 operational launchers of different types. The total number of rockets fired during 1943 exceeded 15 million. These figures illustrate both the escalation of Soviet reliance on rocket artillery and the crisis it imposed on supply, accuracy, and tactical flexibility. What had begun as a secret experimental weapon in 1941 had by now become an indispensable but resource-hungry pillar of Soviet firepower. The challenge for the coming campaigns was to harness this weapon effectively in the largest operations of the war without letting its limitations outweigh its advantages. The summer of 1943 brought the Battle of Kursk, the largest armored confrontation of the war and the most extensive test of Soviet artillery coordination up to that point. Within this vast clash, the Katysha played a central role. The Red Army, anticipating the German offensive since the spring, constructed defensive belts stretching up to 250 kilometers in depth. These defenses relied heavily on artillery and minefields to blunt the attacking force. Among the artillery assets positioned in the Kursk salient were more than 3,000 Katysha launchers organized into Guards mortar brigades and regiments under front-level command. The opening phase of the battle on 5th of July 1943 demonstrated the scale of Soviet preparation. Hours before German armored spearheads of Army Group Center and South advanced, Soviet artillery, including Katysha brigades, unleashed a massive preemptive barrage on assembly areas. Archival data indicates that over 600 rocket launchers fired in the first hours, releasing tens of thousands of M13 rockets in concentrated salvos. The objective was to disrupt German formations before they could fully deploy. Reports from German divisions such as the 9th Panzer and the Grossdeutschland Division noted delays in starting the attack due to fires, destroyed vehicles, and communication breakdowns. Although the offensive proceeded, the preparatory strike had weakened the momentum at the outset. As the battle unfolded, rocket artillery became a crucial element of Soviet defensive fire plans. Guards mortar units were positioned to deliver rapid, concentrated strikes on identified penetration points. At the northern sector near Ponyri, Katysha batteries were tasked with saturating German infantry assaults, while in the south near Prokhorovka, they were reserved for counter-preparation barrages against massing panzer formations. The wide dispersion of rockets meant that effectiveness was greatest against soft targets, supply dumps, and assembly areas. During the critical fighting of 12th of July near Prokhorovka, when the 2nd SS Panzer Corps clashed with Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, multiple Katyusha brigades fired successive salvos to disrupt German infantry support and rear echelons, though their impact on armored spearheads was limited compared to anti-tank guns and mines. The logistical dimension of Katyusha use at Kursk was immense. Each brigade could expend over 1,000 rockets in a single day, requiring rapid resupply by motor transport. Lend-Lease Studebaker trucks again proved vital, both as launch platforms and ammunition carriers. Soviet records indicate that some brigades fired more than 10,000 rockets over the course of the battle. The supply chain was tested to its limits, with ammunition depots positioned close to the front and resupply convoys moving continuously despite German air raids. German countermeasures were also more organized than in 1941 or 1942. Luftwaffe reconnaissance units actively searched for rocket batteries, and Stuka dive bombers were assigned to attack suspected positions immediately after salvos. Nevertheless, the mobility of truck-mounted launchers enabled Soviet crews to avoid heavy losses. Estimates suggest that less than 10% of Katyusha launchers committed at Kursk were destroyed, despite the intensity of fighting. The Germans also employed their own Nebelwerfers extensively, creating duels of rocket artillery across the battlefield. The psychological effect remained a key factor. German soldiers described the barrages as overwhelming, with one account noting that the earth itself seemed to shake under the weight of fire. For Soviet troops, the sound of Katyusha salvos often provided reassurance that higher command was actively supporting their sector. Propaganda emphasized this role, presenting the rocket artillery as a symbol of Soviet technological ingenuity and collective strength. By the end of the battle, Soviet forces had not only absorbed the German offensive, but launched their own counteroffensives, pushing back Army Groups Center and South. Katyusha units participated in the subsequent Orel and Belgorod-Kharkov operations, firing massive preparatory salvos to support breakthroughs. Their contribution was not decisive on its own, but in combination with minefields, anti-tank defenses, and conventional artillery, the rocket barrages played a significant role in exhausting German formations and enabling Soviet counterstrokes. In numerical terms, the Soviet Union entered Kursk with more than 500 Guards mortar battalions, fielding over 3,000 launchers of various calibers. Millions of rockets were expended during July and August 1943. This represented the peak of Katyusha deployment during a single campaign. The lessons of Kursk confirmed both the strengths and limitations of the weapon. Devastating against concentrations and morale, but limited against armored targets and demanding in logistics. From this point forward, Katyusha fire would be an inseparable part of Soviet offensive operations across the Eastern Front, applied on an ever larger scale as the Red Army advanced toward the western borders of the Soviet Union. By late 1943 and into 1944, the Red Army no longer regarded Katyusha units as special-purpose formations, but as a routine, standardized component of its artillery strength. The experience of Kursk had shown both their destructive potential and their limitations, forcing Soviet commanders to refine tactics, expand production, and adopt new methods to maximize efficiency. The period of resistance and adaptation thus reflected not only Soviet efforts to strengthen the weapon's battlefield role, but also German attempts to neutralize it through countermeasures and doctrine. One of the most important Soviet adaptations was the refinement of salvo concentration. Early in the war, rocket launchers had often been used piecemeal, sometimes in isolated batteries. By 1943, the doctrine emphasized firing in massed groups, concentrating multiple brigades on a narrow sector. This approach magnified the destructive effect despite inherent inaccuracy. For example, during the January 1944 Leningrad-Novgorod offensive, the Red Army employed entire divisions of Guards mortars in concentrated preparation fire, releasing more than 30,000 rockets within hours. Reports noted the complete destruction of German forward positions and communication trenches, allowing infantry to advance with reduced initial resistance. Camouflage and mobility also became institutionalized. Katyusha units were ordered to occupy firing positions only minutes before launch, using natural cover, smoke screens, or night movement to conceal deployment. After firing, crews had to relocate immediately, often within 5 minutes, to avoid counter-battery fire or airstrikes. Standard operating procedure included pre-prepared alternate firing sites, coordinated by regimental staff. This adaptation greatly reduced losses. German records confirm the difficulty of neutralizing rocket units. Even when launch sites were identified, by the time artillery or aircraft struck, the trucks were usually gone. The Germans responded by integrating reconnaissance, counter-battery fire, and tactical aviation. Sound ranging and flash spotting units were expanded to detect rocket launches, while Nebelwerfer units provided retaliatory fire. Luftwaffe Stukas and FW-190 fighter bombers were tasked with hunting down Katyusha concentrations. Despite these measures, the mobility of truck-mounted launchers and the increasing availability of Studebaker transports from Lend-Lease allowed the Soviets to maintain effectiveness. By early 1944, most Guards mortar brigades had been fully motorized, significantly improving survivability compared to earlier stages of the war. The variety of launcher types also reflected Soviet adaptation. The standard BM-13 remained the core system, but the BM-8 offered a lighter option for rapid deployment with mechanized or cavalry units, while the BM-31 delivered heavier warheads against fortified positions. By 1944, Guards mortar brigades typically included a mix of these launchers, enabling flexibility in operations. Production statistics highlight the scale. More than 10,000 BM-13s, 3,000 BM-8s, and several hundred BM-31s had been produced by mid-1944, with rocket production exceeding 40 million rounds since 1941. Another dimension of adaptation was integration with other arms. Whereas in 1941-42 rocket units had operated in relative isolation, by 1943-44 they were incorporated into combined arms fire plans. Coordination with conventional artillery and aviation was improved through centralized fire control. Rocket salvos were often synchronized with bomber strikes or artillery barrages, creating layered fire effects. This integration increased battlefield efficiency and reduced the waste of ammunition on abandoned or dispersed targets, a problem that had plagued early operations. On the German side, the Nebelwerfer became the closest counterpart to the Katyusha. These 6 or 10 barrel launchers fired 150 mm, 210 mm, or even 300 mm rockets with higher accuracy and longer range than Soviet M13s. However, their mobility lagged behind, as many were towed by half-tracks or trucks and could not redeploy as quickly. German soldiers valued their accuracy, but acknowledged the superior saturation effect of Soviet launchers. On both sides, rocket artillery became an established part of the battlefield, supplementing rather than replacing conventional guns. The psychological toll remained significant. Soviet troops viewed the howling rocket salvos as a sign of overwhelming firepower in their favor, while German reports frequently cited morale effects, particularly among less experienced formations. Captured German documents from 1944 note that infantry often dispersed prematurely when Katyusha barrages were expected, complicating defensive cohesion. Soviet commanders exploited this by timing rocket fire to precede assaults, ensuring that defenders were disoriented during the crucial moments of contact. By mid-1944, in preparation for the massive summer offensive known as Operation Bagration, the Red Army concentrated record numbers of rocket launchers. The Western, 1st Belarusian, and 1st Baltic fronts fielded dozens of Guards mortar brigades, with some sectors massing over 600 launchers. The doctrine of concentrated mobile rocket fire was now fully mature, the result of 3 years of adaptation and resistance against German countermeasures. Katyusha units had moved from secrecy and experimentation to mass deployment as one of the defining features of Soviet firepower. The summer of 1944 marked the decisive turning point in the war on the Eastern Front, and within this transformation, the Katyusha assumed a central role. Operation Bagration, launched on 22 June 1944, was the largest Soviet offensive of the war aimed at destroying German Army Group Center in Belarus. The Red Army mobilized more than 2.3 million soldiers, 5,800 tanks, and nearly 7,000 aircraft. To prepare the battlefield, Soviet planners allocated an unprecedented concentration of artillery, including more than 2,300 Katyusha launchers, organized into Guards mortar brigades and divisions. This represented the peak deployment of rocket artillery in any single campaign. The preparatory bombardment on 22nd June was among the most extensive in military history. Soviet sources report that over 500,000 shells and rockets were fired during the opening phase. Katyusha brigades were tasked with saturating German forward positions, artillery batteries, and command posts. In some sectors, as many as 500 launchers fired simultaneously, releasing more than 8,000 rockets in minutes. The effect was devastating. German defensive lines manned by the 4th and 9th Armies were smashed, trenches collapsed, and communication lines severed. Survivors recalled the sudden destruction of entire battalion positions before the infantry assault even began. The mobility of rocket artillery ensured that this firepower was not limited to the opening hours. As Soviet armored and mechanized corps advanced, Guards mortar brigades followed, setting up new firing positions to bombard road junctions, retreating German columns, and strong points. During the encirclement battles around Vitebsk and Bobruisk, rocket salvos disrupted German attempts to form defensive lines. A single brigade could blanket an entire village or forested area, forcing German units to disperse and retreat under chaotic conditions. Reports from the German 12th Infantry Division describe whole convoys destroyed by concentrated rocket fire, vehicles overturned and burning, and survivors unable to regroup under continued barrages. The logistical scale of Bagration highlighted the maturity of Soviet rocket artillery operations. Each brigade consumed thousands of rockets daily, requiring massive supply columns. Soviet records estimate that over 1.5 million rockets were expended during the campaign. This demand was met by both Soviet production and Allied supplied transport. Lend-Lease Studebaker trucks carried not only launchers, but also the bulk of ammunition. Soviet commanders noted that the reliable engines and large payloads of these vehicles made it possible to sustain rocket fire during rapid advances, something that had been impossible in 1941-42. German countermeasures were largely ineffective. The speed of Soviet breakthroughs and the scale of rocket concentrations overwhelmed local defenses. Attempts at counter-battery fire were frustrated by the mobility of Katyusha units, which relocated after each salvo. Luftwaffe strikes against rocket positions achieved only limited success due to Soviet air superiority by mid-1944. Even the Nebelwerfer, once a feared counterpart, could not match the volume and mobility of Soviet rocket artillery on this scale. German commanders increasingly referred to Katyushas as one of the most destructive elements of Soviet offensive firepower, contributing significantly to the collapse of Army Group Center. The turning point was not only operational but also psychological. The massed fire of Katyushas became a symbol of Soviet superiority in firepower, reinforcing the image of an unstoppable advance. German morale suffered as entire positions were annihilated in minutes, while Soviet soldiers saw the rocket barrages as a prelude to victory. Propaganda units filmed and photographed salvos, using them to showcase Soviet technological power both domestically and abroad. By the conclusion of Operation Bagration in August 1944, Army Group Center had been virtually destroyed. German losses exceeded 400,000 men, including 28 of 34 divisions committed to the front. While armored and infantry operations achieved the encirclements, rocket artillery played a decisive role in breaking the front open and preventing German forces from stabilizing defensive lines. The campaign demonstrated the full potential of Katyushas when employed in mass under favorable operational conditions. From this point forward, the Soviet Union maintained momentum. Rocket artillery brigades were redeployed westward, supporting offensives into Poland and the Baltic states. The turning point had been reached. Not only had the Red Army regained strategic initiative, but it now possessed overwhelming firepower in artillery, armor, and air. Katyusha units stood as a core element of this advantage, embodying the transformation of Soviet military power from desperate defense in 1941 to relentless offensive in 1944. As the Red Army advanced into Eastern Europe in late 1944 and 1945, the Katyusha remained a prominent feature of Soviet operations, employed in both breakthrough assaults and the destruction of fortified cities. The aftermath of Operation Bagration had demonstrated the decisive effect of massed rocket artillery, and subsequent campaigns in Poland, the Baltics, East Prussia, and finally Germany saw Katyushas employed on an even wider front. By this stage of the war, the weapon had become a standard element of Soviet artillery doctrine, no longer novel, but indispensable. During the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, the Red Army concentrated overwhelming firepower for the initial assault. Along a 500-kilometer front, over 40,000 artillery pieces and mortars were deployed, including more than 2,000 Katyusha launchers. On 12th of January, a preparatory bombardment began with a thunderous barrage of conventional artillery followed by mass rocket salvos. Entire German defensive belts along the Vistula collapsed under the combined weight of fire. Guards mortar brigades, advancing behind the spearheads of the 1st Belarusian and 1st Ukrainian fronts, repeatedly relocated to deliver strikes against German strongpoints and transport hubs. German defensive reports describe villages turned into burning wreckage within minutes, while retreating columns on the Polish plains were shattered by successive rocket salvos. The advance into East Prussia in early 1945 brought Katyushas into one of the most fortified regions in Europe. German defenses included concrete bunkers, minefields, and entrenched artillery. Here, heavy rocket systems like the BM-31 proved especially valuable. With their 28-kilogram warheads, they were capable of demolishing fortified positions that standard 132mm rockets could only damage superficially. Soviet commanders concentrated rocket brigades to precede infantry assaults on fortified towns such as Königsberg and Pillau. The bombardments destroyed not only defensive structures, but also civilian infrastructure, highlighting the devastating effect of area saturation fire in densely populated regions. Logistics again played a critical role. By 1945, Soviet industry had produced more than 10,000 Katyusha launchers of various types and tens of millions of rockets. This ensured that the advancing fronts could maintain continuous firepower. At the same time, ammunition consumption reached unprecedented levels. During the Berlin offensive in April 1945, Soviet records indicate that rocket brigades fired more than 70,000 rockets in the preparatory bombardments alone. Supply columns moved constantly, with Lend-Lease Studebakers still forming the backbone of rocket artillery mobility. The ability to sustain such massive firepower illustrated how fully the Katyusha had been absorbed into the Soviet war machine. In Berlin, rocket artillery was used extensively in the reduction of outer defenses and urban strongpoints. On 16 April 1945, the opening of the assault on the Silo Heights included one of the largest single rocket barrages of the war. Hundreds of launchers fired simultaneous salvos, saturating German forward trenches. Although the defenders held temporarily due to prepared positions, the bombardment inflicted heavy casualties and disrupted command and control. In subsequent days, Katyusha brigades moved closer into the city, where their area fire devastated entire blocks. While accuracy remained limited, the saturation effect was devastating against infantry, light artillery, and supply depots. The German capital, already subjected to weeks of conventional artillery and air bombardment, now also experienced the full force of Soviet rocket artillery. German countermeasures by 1945 were minimal. The Wehrmacht had neither the resources nor the mobility to effectively respond to massed rocket fire. Luftwaffe strength had collapsed, and counter-battery fire was largely ineffective against the mobility of Katyusha units. Naval-Werfer batteries still operated, but their numbers were too few, and their logistical base too weak to compete. German reports often noted the near impossibility of stabilizing defensive lines under the constant threat of rocket barrages. The human impact of this final phase was immense. Civilians in East Prussia, Poland, and Germany were exposed to the same saturation fire as military positions. Rocket salvos destroyed towns, rail yards, and refugee columns. While Soviet doctrine aimed at military objectives, the area nature of the weapon meant civilian areas were often struck. Contemporary accounts from Königsberg and Berlin describe the terror of incoming rocket barrages, with buildings collapsing in seconds and entire neighborhoods engulfed in fire. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the Katyusha had participated in every major Soviet offensive since 1941. Its role in the final campaigns of the war demonstrated the full evolution of the weapon, from secret experimental launchers at Orsha to thousands of units deployed across a continent. In the aftermath of combat, destroyed German cities and abandoned rocket tubes testified to the scale of devastation unleashed by Stalin's organ. The end of the Second World War left the Soviet Union with a military legacy defined not only by its vast tank armies and infantry strength, but also by its artillery innovations, among which the Katyusha stood out as both symbol and instrument of Soviet victory. From its first salvo at Orsha in July 1941 to the massive barrages at Berlin in April 1945, the weapon demonstrated how mobility, concentrated firepower, and industrial mass production could combine to transform the battlefield. Its legacy extended far beyond the wartime period, shaping Soviet military doctrine, Cold War arsenals, and even cultural memory. In purely military terms, the significance of the Katyusha lay in its ability to deliver shock firepower rapidly and on a large scale. Between 1941 and 1945, Soviet industry produced more than 10,000 launchers of all types and over 40 million rockets. By the end of the war, Guards mortar brigades were a permanent feature of every major front, and rocket artillery divisions could deliver thousands of rockets in minutes, something no other army achieved on the same scale. The impact was not only destructive but also psychological. German accounts repeatedly described the terror of incoming salvos, while Soviet soldiers saw the weapons as proof of technological superiority. This dual effect, material damage and morale warfare, ensured that rocket artillery remained a central concept in post-war Soviet doctrine. The Katyusha also influenced the global development of multiple rocket launchers. The weapon demonstrated the advantages of saturation fire, wide area destruction, rapid deployment, and lower production cost compared to heavy artillery pieces. After 1945, the Soviet Union refined the concept into new systems such as the BM-14, BM-24, and most famously the BM-21 Grad, introduced in the 1960s. The Grad became one of the most widely deployed rocket artillery systems in the world, exported to dozens of countries within the Warsaw Pact, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. The lineage from the BM-13 Katyusha to the BM-21 Grad illustrates the long-term military significance of the wartime weapon. It provided the template for Cold War-era rocket artillery and ensured that the concept of massed rocket fire remained alive in modern armed forces. Politically, the Katyusha contributed to the Soviet image of technological resilience and military might. In the wartime period, it served as a symbol of Stalin's industrial mobilization, demonstrating that even under invasion and evacuation, the Soviet state could produce advanced weaponry on a massive scale. After the war, the weapon became part of Soviet propaganda about the Great Patriotic War. Veterans' memoirs often recalled the first time they heard or saw a Katyusha salvo as a moment of inspiration. Songs, films, and monuments celebrated the weapon, embedding it in national memory not just as a machine, but as a cultural icon. The popular wartime song Katyusha, from which the nickname derived, became linked inseparably with the rocket launchers, reinforcing the association between technological power and patriotic spirit. Yet historical debates continue regarding the actual effectiveness of the Katyusha. Military historians point out that while the weapon delivered devastating area fire, its accuracy was poor and dispersion often wasted rockets. Against hardened positions or armored units, it was less effective than conventional artillery or specialized anti-tank weapons. Moreover, the logistical burden was immense. Supplying millions of rockets required enormous transport capacity, much of it provided by Allied Lend-Lease vehicles. Without Studebaker trucks, which became the primary launcher chassis by 1943, the mobility and operational effectiveness of Katyushas would have been far less. Some scholars argue that the weapon's reputation exceeded its battlefield efficiency, shaped by propaganda, and its terrifying sound rather than by measurable results. Others counter that its ability to paralyze enemy movements, disrupt communications, and collapse morale gave it an operational impact that cannot be captured by casualty figures alone. The legacy also includes the German response. The Nebelwerfer family of rocket launchers, deployed from 1942 onward, represented a parallel approach. German rockets were more accurate and offered larger calibers, but they lacked the Soviet emphasis on mass mobility. After 1945, German technology in rocketry contributed to both American and Soviet missile programs, yet it was the Soviet model of mobile saturation launchers that defined post-war rocket artillery. This contrast underscores the strategic significance of the Katyusha. It was not only a weapon of war, but also a prototype of Cold War firepower. Beyond the Soviet Union, the Katyusha influenced global military thought. During the Korean War, 1950-53, both Soviet and Chinese forces employed rocket artillery derived from wartime models. Later, during conflicts in the Middle East, such as the Yom Kippur War of 1973, descendants of the Katyusha played a prominent role in Arab armies, particularly in Egyptian and Syrian forces. Guerrilla movements and non-state actors also adopted the concept. The term Katyusha came to be applied generically to any improvised or truck-mounted rocket system. From Vietnam to Lebanon, the legacy of Soviet wartime innovation continued in conflicts far removed from the Eastern Front. The weapon's cultural impact was equally lasting. In Soviet and post-Soviet societies, the Katyusha became a symbol of national pride. Monuments featuring launchers on pedestals were erected across the former USSR, often in towns and cities where Guards mortar units had fought. Museums dedicated to the Great Patriotic War routinely feature intact BM-13s as central exhibits. The image of the truck-mounted launchers, rails elevated skyward, has become one of the most iconic visual representations of the Soviet contribution to World War II. In literature, film, and popular culture, Katyusha barrages symbolize both the brutality of total war and the determination of the Red Army to defend and liberate its territory. The historical significance of the Katyusha lies, therefore, in its dual identity, both a practical weapon of mass destruction and a cultural political icon. Practically, it was a pioneering step in rocket artillery, influencing decades of weapons development. Politically, it embodied Soviet resilience and industrial capacity under the most extreme conditions. Culturally, it became a memory anchor for the narrative of the Great Patriotic War, enshrined alongside the T-34 tank and the PPSH submachine gun as quintessentially Soviet tools of victory. Modern scholarship continues to refine understanding of the Katyusha's role. Archival research shows the scale of production and deployment in greater detail, confirming its logistical demands and battlefield limitations. Comparative studies of artillery effectiveness highlight that while conventional guns inflicted more overall casualties, rocket artillery's impact lay in disruption and psychological pressure. The debate over its efficiency versus its symbolic power illustrates the broader question of how military technology shapes not just combat outcomes, but also national narratives. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the Katyusha had fired millions of rockets across thousands of kilometers of front, from Orsha to Berlin. Its thunderous barrages preceded Soviet victories in battles that defined the Eastern Front. In the long aftermath, the weapon influenced armies worldwide, provided the foundation for Cold War rocketry, and became an enduring symbol of Soviet strength. Its deadly symphony was not only heard by those who faced it in the fields of Belarus, Ukraine, and Germany, but continues to echo in history, as one of the defining sounds of 20th century warfare.